at declassified Soviet paranormal files, what they were hiding. The Soviet government spent 40 years and billions of rubles trying to kill people with their minds. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's not a Cold War rumor whispered between defectors. That is documented. It is on record. And the files that prove it have been sitting in plain sight for years, buried under declassification stamps, translated poorly, and quietly ignored by mainstream media. Tonight, we're going through those files. We're talking about a secret Soviet program so ambitious, so disturbing, and so heavily funded that when American intelligence finally got confirmation of its existence, they didn't laugh. They panicked, and then they started their own version. By the end of this video, you'll understand what the Soviets were actually researching behind closed doors, what they claimed to have achieved, and why the most unsettling part of this story isn't what they found. It's what happened to that research after the Soviet Union collapsed. To understand what the USSR was doing, you need to understand the atmosphere of the Cold War. This wasn't just a conflict of missiles and satellites. It was a war of every possible advantage. And by the early 1960s, Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, had become convinced that the human mind itself was a weapon waiting to be unlocked. The program that emerged from that conviction was called psychotronics, not to be confused with science fiction. The Soviets used this term to describe the serious, structured scientific study of phenomena that fell outside accepted physics: telepathy, remote viewing, psychokinesis, and what they called biological field manipulation. The paper trail begins in 1965 with a classified report submitted to the Kremlin by the Soviet Academy of Sciences. The report, portions of which were declassified after 1991, acknowledged that American parapsychology research was advancing and warned that the United States might achieve a psychic gap analogous to the nuclear gap of the 1950s. The Kremlin's response was immediate. Funding was approved, institutes were established, and scientists who had previously been quietly ridiculed for their interest in these subjects were suddenly given laboratories, budgets, and security clearances. One of those scientists was Dr. Gennady Sergeyev, a neurophysiologist attached to the Leningrad Institute. Sergeyev developed what became known as the Sergeyev detector, a device designed to measure what he described as the biological field emanating from the human body. His classified research files, partially surfaced through Soviet archive leaks in the mid-1990s, describe experiments in which subjects allegedly influenced electronic equipment, disrupted compass readings, and, most disturbingly, caused measurable physiological stress in other human subjects from across a shielded room. These weren't fringe figures operating on the margins. These were state-sponsored scientists working under military supervision, reporting directly to Soviet intelligence. But here's where the story gets strange. And I mean genuinely strange. Among the partially declassified files that emerged following the Soviet collapse is a series of internal memos referencing a subject known only as Ninel, a woman described in the documents as the most significant psychophysical asset identified in the 20th century. Ninel was almost certainly Nina Kulagina, a housewife from Leningrad who first came to official attention in the 1960s after neighbors reported witnessing objects moving around her without physical contact. What makes Kulagina different from the dozens of other so-called psychics the Soviets evaluated is what came next. She was tested, formally, repeatedly, under strict laboratory conditions with multiple scientific observers present and recording equipment running. And the footage from those sessions, grainy black and white film that you can still find online, shows compass needles spinning, small objects sliding across tables, and in one deeply uncomfortable sequence, what appears to be a frog's heart being stopped and restarted by a woman sitting 2 feet away with her hands in her lap. Western scientists who reviewed the footage were divided. Some dismissed it, others were not so sure. What's harder to dismiss is this: the KGB spent nearly a decade monitoring, testing, and protecting Nina Kulagina. You don't do that for a fraud. The internal files describe her as showing genuine and reproducible anomalous effects. And they note that exposure to her during high-output sessions left researchers with symptoms including rapid heartbeat, disorientation, and in 2 documented cases, temporary vision disturbances. The Soviets weren't just studying her, they were trying to understand how to replicate her and how to deploy what she could do. If you're finding this as unsettling as I am, hit that like button and subscribe, because what the documents reveal next is something the mainstream history books have never touched. By the 1970s, the program had expanded far beyond individual subjects like Kulagina, a facility operating under the cover name Institute of Technical Parapsychology. Referenced in multiple GRU defector testimonies, including those of Oleg Gordievsky, the senior KGB officer who defected to British intelligence in 1985, was reportedly running programs in 3 specific areas. First, remote viewing. Soviet intelligence was attempting to train operatives to perceive classified locations and military installations without physically being present. This mirrors the American Child Stargate project, which was declassified in 1995 and confirmed that the CIA ran a nearly identical program for over 20 years. Second, psychic disruption. Experiments focused on whether a trained or naturally gifted individual could remotely impair the cognitive function of a target, essentially causing confusion, memory loss, or incapacitation at a distance. Third, and this is the one that receives the least attention, mass psychological influence. Documents reference theoretical research into broadcasting altered psychological states across populations using what the files describe as resonant biofield transmission. Whether this ever moved beyond theory is unknown. The files that would answer that question remain classified. So what do we make of all of this? There are 3 serious positions worth considering. The first is that the Soviet program produced nothing of genuine scientific value, that it was an elaborate paranoid arms race built on bad science and confirmation bias, driven by the fear that the Americans might be ahead. The second position is more uncomfortable. It holds that the program did produce results, not consistently, not reliably, but enough to sustain 40 years of classified funding. Under this view, the most sensitive findings were never declassified, and elements of the research were quietly absorbed into successor programs run by Russian intelligence after 1991. The third theory is the one that surfaces in defector testimony and in the margins of partially redacted documents. It suggests that the research didn't stop, that it evolved, and that what was learned about human biofields, psychic disruption, and mass psychological influence informed developments in electronic warfare, directed energy weapons, and influence operations that we are still, right now, trying to fully understand. None of these theories are provably complete, but none of them can be fully dismissed either. Here is the most disturbing part of this entire story. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the scientists didn't vanish. The research didn't burn. The files were partially archived, partially sold, and partially walked out of buildings in briefcases by people who understood exactly what they were carrying. A number of former Soviet psychotronics researchers were subsequently hired by private defense contractors in Russia, the United States, and countries that preferred not to be named. The knowledge didn't end. It transferred. And the next time you read about directed energy incidents, about diplomats experiencing unexplained neurological symptoms in foreign postings, what became known as Havana Syndrome, remember that there is a documented 40-year history of a government that tried to make exactly that happen, deliberately, scientifically, successfully enough to keep trying. Thank you for watching. This subject goes deeper than any single video can cover, and we'll be returning to it because there are specific documents, specific programs, and specific individuals in this story that deserve their own deep dives. But before you go, I want to ask you something. Given everything in those files, and the funding, the subjects, the results that couldn't be explained away, do you think the research actually worked? Or do you think governments on both sides were chasing a shadow that was never really there? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. If this video opened a door for you, please like it and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep going. And there is a lot more to come. I'll see you in the next one.